At the city hospital, one of the most recognized and respected doctors on staff was Dr. Javier Montenegro. At just 32 years old, this young doctor had already managed to establish himself as a leading professional in the field of internal medicine. His office was always full. His patients trusted him not only for his skill and knowledge, but also for his empathy and ability to listen. Javier was someone who knew how to connect with his patients, and that made him, in addition to his medical skill, admired by those who worked with him. Javier had a strict routine. He dedicated his days to his patients and his nights to studying new cases and diseases. At first glance, he seemed like someone who had no time for anything other than his career, but that changed when he met a patient who would mark a before and after in his life: Sofia Lopez. Sofia was a 27-year-old girl, with a delicate appearance and a smile that caught everyone's attention. At first, she attended Javier's office for minor ailments: headaches, trouble sleeping, and mild fatigue that seemed to have no apparent cause. The reasons for her visits were constant, and although they were not serious illnesses, Javier always received her with his characteristic professionalism, taking the time to listen to her concerns. Over time, their visits became more and more frequent. Each consultation seemed to last a little longer than the last, and the conversations began to go beyond the strictly medical scope. Javier began to notice that Sofia had a complex life. She was anxious, and on more than one occasion, he heard her talk about the pressure and stress she was under. It was clear to him that her problems were not just physical. There was something deeper behind those constant visits. What began as a doctor-patient relationship slowly transformed into a friendship. Each consultation was an opportunity for both of them to get to know each other a little better, and although Javier knew he was crossing an unethical line by getting emotionally involved, he felt that Sofia understood him like few people did. It was during one of those extended consultations that everything changed. Sofia, sitting on the stretcher, looked him straight in the eyes. The atmosphere was filled with tension and, without saying a word, they both knew there was more than just words between them. Javier slowly approached and, on impulse, Sofia kissed him. In that instant, all barriers were broken. What began as a light brush of lips turned into an overflowing passion that neither of them could contain. From that moment on, Javier and Sofia began a secret relationship, a relationship that broke the hospital rules and codes of ethics, but which they both desired with an intensity they could not avoid. Over time, their encounters moved to a more intimate level. When they could, they met outside the hospital, in discreet places where they could simply be Javier and Sofia, without titles or labels. But the place that excited them the most and where they felt free to live out their romance was the doctor's office itself. They took advantage of the moments when the hospital was quieter, after long days of work, when most of the staff had already finished their shifts. In those stolen moments, they transformed the office into their hideout, a place where their bodies and desires met without restrictions. These encounters in the office became a dangerous routine. They both knew they were at risk of being discovered, but the thrill of the secret and the desire to be together outweighed any fear. Passion consumed them, and every time they crossed the office door, their hearts beat faster, aware that a small oversight could ruin everything. Sometimes, Javier even surprised himself by checking the door and the curtains several times, making sure that no one could see or hear them. Sofia, for her part, felt a mix of adrenaline and fear, but when she was with Javier, the entire outside world disappeared. Their relationship became more than just physical desire. Javier began to feel something deep for Sofia, something he had never experienced before. He had spent years dedicated exclusively to his career, with no room for romance or meaningful relationships, but Sofia awakened a side of him that he thought was dormant. Sofia, for her part, found a kind of refuge in Javier. She knew that he was someone who could understand her, who did not judge her and who listened to her with an attention she had never received before. However, behind the apparent happiness that they both shared in secret, there was a shadow that stalked Sofia. Despite her feelings for Javier, her life was not so simple. In her past, she had left a stormy relationship that still haunted her. An obsessive ex-boyfriend who could not accept that she had moved on. That man, despite the months that had passed since their breakup, continued to look for her, sending her messages and harassing her every time he had the chance. Sofia tried to keep him out of her life, but he always found a way to appear, like a shadow she couldn't shake off. Javier was aware of this situation. Sofia used to talk to him about the times her ex had pursued her or the insistent messages he sent her, trying to get her to come back to him. For Javier, that man represented a constant threat, but he trusted that the love he shared with Sofia would be enough to overcome any obstacle. The days passed, and both enjoyed their forbidden relationship amid their encounters at the doctor's office and their furtive escapes. Although they knew they were risking their careers and reputations, nothing seemed to matter more to them than being together. Sophia, who found in Javier a peace and happiness she had never experienced, felt that she had finally found someone to share her life with. And Javier, who at first thought that this adventure would be fleeting, now realized that his love for Sophia was something serious, something he was willing to protect at all costs. However, both of them were unaware that the relationship they had started in secret and under the shadow of the hospital was about to fall apart. Sophia's past was closer to them than they imagined, and soon, the secret they shared would become the origin of a conflict that would bring tragic and irreparable consequences. As the relationship between Javier and Sophia progressed, the shadow of her ex-boyfriend became more and more present. Although Sophia tried to downplay the messages and calls she received from him, the reality was that the man did not seem willing to let her go. Marcos, as he was called, was a possessive and controlling man, someone who could not bear the idea that Sophia had moved on with her life without him. They had broken up several months ago, but for Marcos, that breakup did not mean the end of the relationship, but rather an obstacle that he needed to overcome to get her back. Sophia, feeling increasingly cornered, began to talk more frequently to Javier about the problems she had with her ex. At one of their appointments, while they were still tangled up in the sheets he had brought for their comfort, she told him how Marcos used to show up at her building unannounced, trying to convince her to come back. Sometimes, he would even wait for her outside her workplace or send her intimidating messages that made her feel constantly on alert. Javier, although he tried to calm her down and assure her that he was there to protect her, couldn't help but feel a growing concern. He knew that this man represented a threat and he feared that, at some point, he could harm them. One afternoon, while they were both resting after one of their encounters at the office, Sophia mentioned that she felt that Marcos was starting to discover certain details of her private life. On one occasion, he had hinted to her that he knew she was seeing someone, and although she tried to divert the conversation, she could not help but feel exposed. Javier tried to reassure her, assuring her that, as long as they were discreet, no one could discover their relationship. But deep down, both he and Sophia knew that Marcos was not someone who would accept defeat easily. He was a person who, if he suspected something, would do everything possible to discover the truth. The fear of being discovered made their encounters become even more clandestine. Javier made sure that no one was around before Sophia arrived at the office, and Sophia, for her part, was careful not to mention anything suspicious about her love life when talking to her friends or co-workers. However, despite all their efforts to keep it a secret, fate seemed to have other plans for them. One day, Marcos decided to take things a step further. He had managed to find out the name of the doctor who was treating Sophia at the hospital. It didn't take him long to find out the details, as he had checked some of her emails and found medical appointments and names that seemed suspicious to him. Determined to confront her, Marcos planned to pay her a surprise visit at Javier's office. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he had a hunch that something strange was going on and that Javier had something to do with it. However, upon arriving at the hospital, Marcos couldn't foresee what he was about to discover. He had carefully calculated the time he thought he would find Sophia there, and although he knew he was breaking boundaries by showing up unexpectedly, his obsession and anger were too intense to stop. He walked through the hospital corridors with firm steps, asking at the reception desk for Dr. Javier Montenegro. The receptionists looked at him curiously, but didn't ask any more questions. They simply pointed him in the direction of the doctor's office. When he reached the office door, Marcos paused for a moment. He listened intently, trying to hear any sound or sign that Sophia was inside. What he heard made the anger inside him rise explosively. Sounds of laughter, murmurs, and finally, the unmistakable sound of two people in an intimate moment. His heart was pounding and his fists clenched in fury. He had come with the intention of talking, of confronting Sophia and getting answers. But now, after hearing those sounds, all rational intention disappeared. Without a second thought, he slammed the office door open. What he saw when he entered the room only served to confirm his worst fears. There, on the exam table, were Javier and Sophia, entangled in a scene of passion that he found unbearable. For an instant, time seemed to stand still. Sophia and Javier, shocked and with their hearts beating 1,000 miles an hour, stared at Marcos with wide eyes, unable to process what was happening. Shame and fear took hold of them, but Marcos was no longer able to see anything other than the betrayal he felt in his heart. Marcos, without saying a word, turned around and left the office, but not before giving them one last look of hatred. The slam of the door echoed in the hallway, and Sophia was left in shock, while Javier tried to calm her down, whispering that everything would be okay and that they would talk to him to solve things. But they both knew that Marcos was not someone easy to convince, and that his reaction would probably bring consequences. From that moment on, Sofia and Javier's life became a nightmare. Marcos began to harass them with hate messages and threats. For Sofia, the fear that Marcos would do something to them was constant, while Javier, although he tried to remain strong and calm, felt that the situation was increasingly out of his control. Not a day went by without them receiving some warning from Marcos, who was in charge of reminding them that nothing they did would go unpunished. Each message, each call, increased the tension between Javier and Sofia, making them feel as if they were on a time bomb about to explode. As the days went by, Sofia began to notice how Javier's personality was changing. He, who had always been a calm and self-assured person, now lived in constant fear that Marcos would show up at the hospital or at his house. Their meetings at the doctor's office became less frequent, and the passion they once shared was replaced by an anxiety that was difficult to control. The situation had become unsustainable, but neither of them dared to take the first step to solve it. Marcos, for his part, could not stop thinking about the incident at the doctor's office. His pride and ego had been deeply hurt, and the image of Javier and Sofia together was repeated over and over again in his mind. He felt that he had been betrayed in the worst way, and with each passing day, his resentment and hatred towards Javier increased. The idea of revenge took hold of him, and soon, that obsession turned into a desire to make the doctor pay for having taken away what he considered his. While Sofia and Javier tried to get their lives back to normal, Marcos began to come up with a plan. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that he needed to be careful not to leave any traces that could incriminate him, but he was determined to carry out his revenge. He didn't care about the price he would have to pay, or the consequences of his actions. For him, Javier was responsible for his pain, and he would do whatever it took to make sure that man never crossed his path again. The calm before the storm lasted for a few days. Javier tried to act as if everything was fine, although his mind kept worrying about Marcos's threats. Sofia, for her part, lived in a constant state of alert, afraid that Marcos would appear at any moment to carry out his threats. They both knew they couldn't live like this forever, but they couldn't imagine that the end of this story was closer than they thought. The days passed and the atmosphere in the hospital became increasingly tense. Even though they tried to move on, both Javier and Sofia couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Marcos had stopped sending messages and calls, but this silence only increased both of their anxiety, as they feared he was planning something. Sofia tried to calm down and convince Javier that everything was fine, but deep down they both knew that this calm was only the prelude to the storm. Marcos, meanwhile, had spent the last few days carefully crafting his plan. The image of Javier and Sofia together haunted him day and night, fueling his hatred and desire for revenge. He had researched Javier's schedule and knew that he often stayed late at his office, reviewing files and preparing cases for the next day. This gave him an idea. Determined to finish him off, he devised a deadly trap that would allow him to carry out his revenge in the most brutal way possible while leaving little evidence of his involvement. One night, when the hospital was already calm and most of the staff had finished their shift, Marcos entered the building. He had waited patiently until the lights went out in most of the offices and only a few employees remained on duty. With a firm step and his heart pounding, he made his way through the corridors until he reached Javier's office. He carried with him a scalpel and gloves, tools with which he planned to finish his mission without leaving any trace of his presence. He knew that at night Javier usually worked in his office with the door closed and that, in general, no one bothered him. Upon arriving, Marcos looked around to make sure no one was around, then slowly turned the doorknob. Javier, absorbed in his work, did not hear when Marcos entered. He had no time to react. As soon as he looked up, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. Marcos's figure was there, threatening and determined, and before Javier could even scream, the scalpel had already done its work. Marcos was relentless, unloading all the pent-up anger in every movement. The office, which had been Javier and Sofia's secret refuge, now became a scene of terror. Blood stained the floor, and the silence of the night covered the hospital like a dark blanket, with no one noticing the tragedy that had just occurred. Once the act was done, Marcos made sure to erase any trace that could link him to the scene. With precise, cold movements, he took off his gloves, placed them in a bag he had brought with him, and checked that there were no visible traces left. Before leaving, he took a last moment to look at Javier's body, now lifeless, and allowed himself a bitter smile. His plan had been a success. Finally, he had managed to finish off the man who had taken Sophia from him. The next morning, the hospital team was the first to hear about it. The scene they found in Javier's office was devastating. No one could believe their eyes. The most respected doctor in the hospital was lying in a pool of blood, the victim of a brutal and unexpected attack. The news spread quickly throughout the hospital, and within minutes, chaos took over. The police were immediately called and began investigating the scene, taking photographs, analyzing evidence, and looking for any clue that could give them a lead on the culprit. When Sophia received the call, her world fell apart. Upon hearing the words, "The doctor has been murdered," her entire body froze. The reality of the situation hit her with brutal force, leaving her breathless and powerless to react. She felt like it was all a nightmare, that at any moment she would wake up and Javier would be there, waiting for her as always. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself, the truth was inescapable. Javier had been murdered, and her life would never be the same again. Sophia arrived at the hospital with a disfigured face, unable to hold back her tears. Seeing the scene, she felt a mixture of pain and guilt that consumed her. Questions crowded her mind. Why had it had to happen? What could she have done to prevent it? Remorse invaded her, making her feel responsible for that tragedy. She knew that, in some way, their forbidden relationship had contributed to Marcos's fury and, at that moment, she deeply regretted every encounter, every secret shared in that consultation that was now the place of Javier's death. The police were quick to focus their suspicions on Marcos. The investigations quickly revealed the conflict between him, Sophia, and the doctor. The messages and threats he had sent to Sophia were solid evidence of his intentions and his ability to commit the crime. After gathering the necessary evidence, the police officers proceeded to arrest him. Marcos did not resist. His gaze was cold and empty, as if the act he had committed had left him without remorse or emotions. She knew she had fulfilled her purpose, and in her twisted mind, she felt she had obtained the justice she had so longed for. The trial was brief. The evidence against Marcos was irrefutable, and the sentence came quickly. He was convicted of murder. Justice did its job, but for Sophia, that meant nothing. Despite the conviction, the void Javier had left in her life was impossible to fill. The man she had loved, her refuge and confidant, was no longer there. Her world had changed forever, and loneliness and pain were now her only companions. Over time, life at the hospital returned to normal. Javier's office was assigned to another doctor, and little by little, the rumors and comments about his tragic end began to fade. For Sophia, however, every corner of that place reminded her of her loss, and every time she passed by the office, she felt a part of her break even more. She could never overcome the sadness or the remorse. The shadow of that forbidden romance and the consequences it brought with it would haunt her forever.